Hi, I'm Sarah Glassberg.
I'm Brad Pilcher.
And this is AJFF In Conversation, the Jewish film podcast.
We talk a lot on this podcast about good films that are critically acclaimed, new releases, personal favorites, and tried and true recommendations. But we've never taken a step back and discussed how we watch films or what exactly makes a film good.
We know many of our listeners are cinephiles who perhaps even serve on our selection committee or attend our festival and can certainly spot cinematic greatness when they see it. But as a former student of film studies myself, even I often forget or overlook some of the key elements of filmmaking and film theory when watching a movie just for fun.
So how do we watch films? And should we be looking at those elements when we're viewing and judging a film? How do we know when a film is objectively good? How does that compare with guilty pleasures? And really, who is the arbiter of what's good, what's a classic, and what's a cult classic?
To help school us on the basics of film analysis, as well as these bigger, really interesting questions around taste, quality, and what makes a film a classic versus a cult hit, is very special guest Millie De Chirico, the TCM programmer behind their weekly late night series of cult hits, TCM Underground, and the co-host of the podcast, I Saw What You Did. Millie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sarah. It's good to be with you and Brad.
So we have a lot to cover with you, a lot of things we're really excited to hear your thoughts on. I think something that we should cover first and foremost, just to kind of build from there, would be these basics, these fundamentals of studying or analyzing films that maybe audiences don't always consciously evaluate or might not have the vocabulary for. I think there are things that are more obvious, like acting or the screenplay, and some that are less so. So, from cinematography to this little thing called mise en scène, can we kind of step through together what those building blocks are of a film?
Sure. I mean, like you said, I think the fairly obvious ones would be things like acting and screenplay and editing even. I actually, maybe that one's a little bit under the radar because some people don't really know a lot about editing, but editing is obviously a big part of how we feel when we watch the film because it's building up, the tension or the drama or even the comedy of something. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people do focus first on acting and they will go and see movies because their favorite actors are in them. And a lot of people go and see certain directors' films. And, I think because they've kind of figured out that there's something about this director that, the kind of auteur theory style of, this author has a point of view and a perspective that is kind of a through line between all of their films, and that's something that people enjoy, common themes and whatnot. But honestly, I think a lot of it, especially for me, is I like, the emotional response that I get from a film. I mean, it could be anything from, sort of the storyline of the characters. I'm very much into the characters of films, and not just the actors per se, but just sort of like what the character's motivations are, what the character is conveying on screen. And, that's part of the screenplay, but it's also acting. It's also time and place of when the film is happening. And, I also love mise en scène. I love sort of what's in the frame. I always joke I'm really into like furniture and lamps and curtains and, housewares, like, especially when a certain character's in, a period piece or something. I'd like to know, like, what's the painting on the wall? What are the books they have on the shelves? What's going on with, sort of what's around them, which is more kind of like a set design or a set decoration thing. So I feel like it's, it's a lot of different things. And I think people come at it from different ways, and some, variables are stronger than others.
How, as you said, people approach watching a film in different ways. They latch onto different things. And sometimes it depends on the film. I mean, sometimes one thing that we didn't talk about yet is sound. And I'm just thinking about Sound of Metal because the Oscars were recently, and I loved the way that film used sound to put you in the shoes of the character. I thought it was really unique and powerful. And so how important or helpful do you think it is to have an understanding of these things or to have the vocabulary for these elements as far as being able to enjoy or appreciate a film? I mean, do you think it adds something significant to the experience or allows you to better evaluate a film's quality? Or can you kind of just go in and not really be picking up on the things within the frame or how the editing is conveying those emotions? Do you need that to watch a film, quote unquote, effectively, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I'm obviously speaking from my own experience here because I went to film school, both undergrad and graduate school. And, but I was also a movie viewer my entire life. So, when I was a kid or when I was, growing up, before I even knew what anything was, I was experiencing movies kind of unaware of what I was seeing. I was coming at it, just kind of from a sensory experience. And, I think about that versus now that I'm, grown up and I have a lot of education about what I'm seeing. And, part of what I think film school is about is also kind of like art appreciation, because it does give you kind of a language for what you're seeing and what you're hearing. And I gotta say, I like the idea that I know what I'm experiencing. Like, I know the techniques and I know, I have that you, like you said, you have a language for it now, or you have a way of kind of understanding what's happening for you as the viewer. But I won't say that I feel like movies are less or more enjoyable because I know that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like, I enjoyed films immensely when I was a kid. And even though I did know, I didn't know what was going on in like Home Alone or something, I still enjoyed it. And I still had, a great time. And I still think of that movie fondly. So it's that thing where I'm like, is it better to know more about yourself, essentially? And some people don't think that. Some people just want the sensory experience or just want to have it as the event, and they don't care to really like think about it that much. But, I think it's just kind of like your mileage may vary. You know what I mean?
I think you hit on something, Millie, that for me is one of the hardest parts about this kind of conversation, which I have all the time with friends, family members who are not cinephiles. They didn't study film. And the problem that I find is when you first point out to people things like cinematography, editing, they immediately gravitate towards the times when film is being super overt about it. And the thing about film language in filmmaking is that it's designed to be invisible. Film is a very realistic medium. It doesn't have to be, but the majority of films are kind of realistic. There's a realism to them. So the language of how you make a cut is designed to be invisible, is designed to kind of just happen and hit you subconsciously. And so when you talk about things like, editing in a sort of frenetic passion, or you talk about the sort of classic Spike Lee shot where he puts the actor on a dolly and kind of rolls them around and the whole background just sort of takes on a very surreal quality. People gravitate towards those instances where suddenly we're being very overt. We're not being invisible with the cuts. We're not being invisible with the cinematography. We're not being invisible with whatever it is we're doing. And that's fine. But there are a lot more filmmakers doing really impressive things, actors, editors, who are doing things without being like super showy about it. And so for me, what you talk about as sort of the emotion of the experience is where I like to start the conversation with people. I don't know if you feel similarly, because for me, it's sort of like saying, okay, let's not talk about, the crazy editing in this sequence, or more recently, I was having a conversation with my wife about The Father and the way that the set design was sort of being changed up throughout the movie to reinforce the dementia, to sort of put you in that place with Anthony Hopkins. And that was a very overt sort of example, but I was like, let's talk about like Chris Nolan films. They're cold. Like we could talk about the editing and the visual effects and sort of it, but like let's talk about the fact that almost all those films feel very cold. Why do they feel cold? Why do they feel cold when another filmmaker's films feel warm? And that to me is a much more interesting conversation because it doesn't require the person I'm talking to like understand mise en scène or try to like take apart cinematography. They just like, how does this film make you feel? And then you can back into what is the filmmaker doing to make it feel that way? Because it is a conscious choice usually to try and get you to feel that way. I don't know if you feel the same way, but that's a struggle I have when I have this kind of conversation with non-cinephiles.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And you're right, because sometimes, I mean, and this is the thing, I mean, sometimes it's the director's point of view to make it that way. Like they have they're taking their own kind of artistic point of view and putting it in a film. And this is this, yeah, and maybe that's informed by, it could be informed by a lot of things, to be honest, but, films that they liked before. I find that that's a big thing too with like, certain directors, I'm like, Paul Schrader loves Ingmar Bergman or whatever. And you can kind of sense that, and you can see that in the tone of some of his films. Right. But then like you do have, filmmakers that will do it as per the character or, the story, where everything that's happening around the character is because of the character. And because, it's like a movie like Joker or something like that, or, and the editing and sort of the pacing of it is based on like who the movie's about or what the movie's about. And yeah, I mean, and I gotta say, like some people, find that interesting. I certainly find that interesting. And then certain people are like, yeah, I don't know. I'm just watching a movie and I don't, I'm kind of just experiencing it almost like it's, an event or like a live concert or something that they're just kind of, they're passively consuming it and they're not really, they don't really understand that everything is a motivation, right?
Yeah. I always felt like, again, I go back to that sort of maxim that I have always sort of lived by when I've watched films, which is that sort of by default, it's a realistic medium. So I think people can fall into that trap of just sort of experiencing it like it's a live concert. And for me, what's more important to try to get across to people that rather than try to get them into the nuances of cutting and editing and cinematography and set design and all this stuff is just to sort of say that everything that you're seeing, everything that you're experiencing is a choice that either the director or the actor or the editor or the cinematographer made to try and accomplish something. What you're seeing on screen is a very artificial, constructed world, even if it looks realistic. Not every film is a science fiction set piece. Not every film is a period piece. Some films, really are just sort of, modern day dramas, but no matter what kind of film you're watching, it's all a choice. So if you're feeling a certain way, if you're having a certain experience, that's a choice. And if you're not feeling a certain way, if you're feeling dissatisfied with what you're seeing, that's also the result of choices. And the more I can get people to think about watching a film that way, the more I think conscious they become, more active they become as viewers, which to me is vastly more important than whether they fully understand the history of, how the cuts and editing and cutting from one thing to another, colors your perception of a scene. Like that's nice. That's great. But, it's not the first thing I want you to take away and on your path to becoming a really informed film viewer.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, it's sort of like, it's kind of like everybody should take like some like real basic level of like art appreciation or something where they just sort of have, at least they understand. I mean, and I will say this, like what you've just said, I think documentary film is sort of the big conversation piece for me about that because a lot of people think that documentaries are real and that they're like, completely done in real time. And a lot of times documentaries have a point of view, and they're informed by editing, what's being left in, what's being left out. And there are a lot of people who think, oh, I'm watching this documentary, it's true fact, and I'm getting some sort of like raw footage, accurate representation of all parties and all everything. But that's not true. And, I do think in cases like that, yeah, it really should be something that people think about. That, obviously every movie there is a choice being made by something, and it's not sort of, real life to the core.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I just wanted to jump in. I think this is a good segue almost into talking about like taste and guilty pleasures, because Brad, something you were saying made me think about my own conversations in my life around some of these film terms. And I know my mom is someone in my life who's like a huge film buff, and she always tells me like, for her, it's always about why she didn't like a film. And I just think that's really interesting. Like if you love a film, I mean, even for me now, it is just that impact and that experience. And I'm not necessarily thinking about the mechanics, but it gives a vocabulary to use for why maybe what you thought you were going to get out of it didn't come across, whatever those choices were didn't leave that impression on you. So my mom always tells me like, oh, ever since I became a film student, like in undergrad and then in grad school, like now she is able to say, why didn't I like that film? Oh yeah, because the editing like made no sense, or it was jumpy, or, the pace felt really off and I couldn't get into the character's point of view for those reasons or whatever. So I just think that's really interesting. And then again, something else I'm thinking of here is how do we kind of reconcile when we do recognize that maybe some of those elements are flawed, but we still have some attachment to a film or enjoyment of a film? Millie, I don't know if you have thoughts on that as we transition into a conversation around cult hits, especially. I mean, what do we do about subjective taste, especially as someone who does know what makes a good, what good cinematography or what solid direction or acting or any of those things look like? What do we do with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, yeah, I feel like, age is a factor. Like I watched this movie. I watched that movie Hereditary with my mom the other night, which she and I had never seen. And, it's a horror movie or, a thriller. And, she had a lot of questions, like she was just like, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know, like, what is, I think she kind of saw it as sort of like, oh, this is really artistic. And I feel like there's something happening, but I can't understand it. And, meanwhile, I was like, oh, that's an interesting, choice to do something like that, to light something this way, to like, edit something like this. And, I think for her and her experience, I mean, she's an older woman and she was just basically like, I don't get it. I don't get what the kids are doing. This is too weird. So, I don't know. I mean, for me, I feel like sometimes, taste just changes through the years. Like I think taste changes in the culture so much, but also within people. And, there are things that I watched when I was a younger person that I had all the time in the world for, like really like, kind of violent horror things and just like weird things and that kind of stuff. And then now, that I'm much older, I sort of go, my mind doesn't necessarily like gravitate towards those films anymore. And I find that like, I like more of and this is, I think, maybe why I kind of gravitate more towards older films, because I like the pacing of older films. They're like, it's not as fast. It's not as flashy. There's not a lot of, there's like funny rapid fire jokes happening, but for the most part, you're still kind of seeing people on a screen for a while. There's not that kind of MTV style cutting. But to your point about taste, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I don't know. I feel like I think everybody thinks they have good taste. So they always think that the stuff that they like is having good taste. And there's a part where I feel like I know when I'm watching a good movie and I know when I'm watching a bad movie. And a lot of times it is based on like the technical parts where I'm like, okay, yeah, this, you can see the boom in this shot and that's not great or whatever. Or like, wow, the editing is really bad and like the sound is really bad. But at the same time, I do see it as something where I'm like, a filmmaker being just technically bad doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have like a point of view, maybe, and they just don't have the tools or the education, for the technical education for things. And, a lot of times that's based on money and stuff. Like if they would have maybe made a better movie if they had, had more money or something. So I hate to say like, oh, I know what good movies are versus bad movies are in a way, because I just feel like there's like a lot involved. And I don't really know if that answers your question, but
it begs the question, Millie, are Ed Wood films good films or bad films? Because you can always see the boom mics and the sets are falling apart, but clearly it influenced Tim Burton. I mean, that's the hardest part, I think, about judging film is like there's the director's goal, there's the filmmaker's goal, and then there's what they're capable of pulling off, and those are not always the same thing. But how do you as an audience, I mean, that's the fun thing about art and film in particular, is there's this interplay. There's what the filmmakers are trying to accomplish, there's what they're actually able to accomplish, and then there's the audience reaction to what is put in front of them. And those are all in tension with each other. And you look at things like the reaction to George Lucas and the Star Wars prequels, and he wanted to do something and the audience wanted something, like that's where you get into issues around fandom and gatekeepers and who's ultimately the arbiter of what's right and wrong. But like, who's to say? I don't know if anybody should be empowered to say this is the good stuff, this is the bad stuff.
Yeah, I think part of what I love about working at TCM is that I feel like TCM is basically like the library in my mind. When I come to, and I'm not just saying that as a person that works in programming there, but just sort of as a fan, it feels like a library. And like the library is going to have like trashy romance novels, but they're also going to have the encyclopedia or whatever. And I love that about TCM is that it to me, it doesn't feel like there's some kind of like judgment a lot of times. Like I feel like they're saying everything is worth watching. And I make that case specifically because I programmed TCM Underground, but I'm just saying, I think even without TCM Underground, if you just look at the schedule, I feel like it's very diverse and it's very, kind of quote unquote highbrow versus lowbrow. It's everything. And I don't know. I mean, I kind of see films in that way too, where I feel like I don't really like the idea of somebody going, this is good and this is bad, because it does feel like taste is subjective and it's changing all the time. Like, within people and within the individual, like I said, I mean, like what you liked when you were 12 is maybe not something you like when you were 50, but, I sort of believe in general access to things and letting like the person kind of decide what's for them and what's not for them.
Yeah, I personally love that. I had a professor in undergrad who told us this story about going to, and he studies like, he writes on Birth of a Nation and Canadian like art house things, and he told us this story that he just had to one day go and watch one of the Fast and Furious movies in the theater, and it was the best time he's ever had. And he used this phrase that has stuck with me all these years, which is value omnivorous consumption. And I have carried that with me ever since, in terms of even I try to diversify what I'm watching and not necessarily always think about, well, who is saying this is good versus this is good and this is bad. I definitely agree with Brad that it really is something we need to all be conscious of, who is really putting these things forth and making these decisions. And that's something I definitely want to have us talk about today. But because you brought up, your role as a programmer at TCM, I would really just love to, hear more about that and start talking a little bit about what makes a cult classic versus a regular classic. Again, who kind of decides that? What is the real definition of a cult hit? Something that I'll just mention is I do think time is a big part of it, which I think is interesting. I also think about examples like The Room, where it goes back to that other thing we were talking about of the director has a particular vision and a goal, and then the audience sees it and runs with it in a completely different way. So I think subversion is a part of it for me. But yeah, I want to hear about your role with TCM and TCM Underground and what your definitions and thoughts are of these things.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I've been at TCM for 17 years, which is it's a ghastly long time, but and when I started out as, just sort of learning to program. I mean, honestly, I used to be a DJ before I was a programmer. And I always tell people that like the skill set is pretty much the same. Like you just are putting together playlists of movies. And, especially for a channel like TCM is 24 hours a day, you really are just kind of like, playing films and kind of organizing films by theme and by, sometimes it's an actor, sometimes it's an actual theme, it's a holiday, it's a whatever. But then in 2006, I got the opportunity to program this sort of like late night cult movie franchise that they wanted to start called TCM Underground. And when we first started, like when I first started programming it, I was young. I had just come out of film school, and there was certainly like the cult movies that I knew were cult movies, which were the classic midnight films like Eraserhead, Pink Flamingos, Ed Wood films, Night of the Living Dead, like that kind of stuff. And over the years, I will say that I think that so much has changed in terms of what Underground sort of has the scope of what is programmable for Underground, I think has changed a lot. And a lot of that has to do with sort of the changing of tastes, like literal age. So like now, after 15 years, so many of the people that were my age, kind of growing up in that kind of 80s VHS culture, now they're like adults. And these are people who are, watching TCM, or they're, going out there and kind of participating in film culture. And a lot of like what, I have programmed since the very beginning kind of lean towards that. It leans towards the kind of video store culture, VHS culture. And it's not this like really rigid definition of what a cult movie is. And at this point, I feel like Underground is just kind of like a repository for a lot of different types of movies. I think the overarching theme of it is that they're either hard to find, irreverent in some way, sort of like kooky plots or kooky storylines, kind of weird, actors or stories or that kind of thing. There's something kind of interesting about it. Sometimes it's literal flops, like just movies that are not, that were not successful when they were first originally produced, a lot of times with major studios, and now are getting like a second look by people. And then there's a lot of like tried and true cult movie favorites still, like, zombie movies and science fiction and, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think that the reason to make it broader for me was just to, if you really have, as a programmer, if you really work within like really strict, rigid definitions, like you're going to run out of movies in like a day. So I always try to keep things broad when I'm thinking of like potential themes or like movies to play or whatever. But I do think that, yeah, over time, the internet has changed everything in terms of access to rare films. So, now it's kind of, I mean, I won't say it's completely impossible, but everything that was sort of the classic, rare, hard to find bootleg films. When I was growing up, all those films are pretty much out on DVD. And not even just that, but like 4K restorations, because you have like all these amazing kind of like reissue DVD labels that are like, you know, they're just out there doing the work. They're like finding the old prints and cleaning them up and putting them out on Blu-ray. And it's kind of incredible. Like I would have never imagined that when I was 17 years old, you know? So yeah, there's cult movies I think have changed so much since I started and when I was young, especially.
I feel like it's interesting because you bring up these Blu-ray releases, but for me as a diehard collector of physical media, there's a little bit of a weird moment in time where the economics around Blu-rays are changing. So there's stuff that might have gotten released in years past, but it's not because people are all streaming. And so there's fewer purchasers for Blu-ray. And I worry that we'll go in the opposite direction. We'll go back to a time when there is stuff that it doesn't make sense to restore it. So it kind of gets lost. There's not the economics where you can recoup the cost of the restorations from something like a physical media release. It doesn't make sense, you know, to stream it. I worry that like we'll get to a place where where we don't have access to all these films again. And I know TCM is a great place for people who love classic films. That's why I love TCM. But like the reality is TCM does not own all of the classic films in the world. So do you worry at all about the way in which the consumption of film and the home video business model is going to impact the accessibility of films?
I do actually, because I notice this a lot with studio films. And right now, I go through these like giant studio libraries like literally every day at work. And there's so many, I would say, especially 90s and 2000s, maybe early 2000s movies that are in these libraries. And you're right, it's hard to recoup the cost. It's hard to make a case to restore a film. I think, especially if you're a big company, it's hard to, the financials of it, are hard to justify, because the thing about these reissue labels right now that are doing like horror and they're kind of doing the genre stuff. A lot of times, the movies that they're restoring, they didn't really cost that much to make. The rights were not extremely, the rights were not kind of cost prohibitive. And so it's sort of easier to recoup money from putting out, a Blu-ray release of a movie that didn't cost so much money to make. But with, studio films, I'm sure it's more of a gamble. And so I find that a lot of times there's movies that are just sort of not available anymore. And if you manage to get the standard def DVD and like then, whenever the DVD, boom was really happening, that's pretty much the only copy of it. You probably won't see it on a Blu-ray or won't see it in a 4K restoration somewhere, because it costs too much to put out like, an indie sleeper from like 1995 or something. So yeah, I mean, it's an issue for sure, because there are so many good movies that are in these libraries that, for whatever reason or another, it doesn't make sense to, really put forth this really big effort to restore them and to do, big things with them. And that's kind of a shame.
Something that I wanted to ask, going back a little bit to what you were talking about before, but I think it also does potentially play into this question of, restoration on physical media, or even just kind of, I'm thinking about this question of the designations or definitions of classics and cult hits getting blurred. I'm not sure if there is a direct correlation there between something that there is an investment in bringing back out into the, doing a 4K restoration of, or even just culturally kind of reclaiming something. Because when I think of a classic, going back a little bit further into some of those original things we were talking about, auteurs and really technical quality and things like that. That's where my brain goes. But I know cult hits, as you said, are sometimes offbeat or have an untraditional structure or something, or was overlooked maybe because of quality at first. But so I don't know, do you think that over time there has been some blurring between classic and cult hit, and what do you think causes that, if so?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because I always say that I think that cult movies have moved into, I don't know what to call it, if it's kind of this art space or that are being appreciated. I mean, it's like the Criterion Collection put out John Waters movies. Case closed. You know what I mean? Like, for the longest time, I'm like, I think that there was no thought in anyone's mind that he would ever be on the Criterion Collection. But I think that's changed. And I don't know if it's because of time. I mean, we keep going back to that concept of like the idea that like history, time just like sort of wears out the clock on like good and bad or whatever. But I think that is interesting because, yeah, I think that they're sort of film snobs, quote unquote, that I always kind of knew about or knew the stereotype about for so long. I think they do like cult films. They do like, I think it's more about, at this point, it comes more from an archivist or a preservationist standpoint now than it did before. Like, I think before it was literally just like, I like good stuff and this is bad stuff and I don't like bad stuff. Now it's just sort of like, all like movies are sacred and it sort of doesn't matter if it's, something that is trashy or not trashy or whatever. Because I do think the notion of saving films is even more important now because now we have the internet and we're trying to, preserve things. We're trying to preserve the culture. And so I think now, like I said, those lines are really blurred. Because I know there are people who love very important films, quote unquote, that do dabble in fun, campy, weird stuff. So I feel like maybe I'm one of them. I hope I am.
I feel like cult classic, like the definition of that's in the name. It's cult. There is this dedicated fandom around that film or that genre that has to be there, and that's the thing that's keeping it alive in the zeitgeist. Because there's tons of movies that have been made, they have been released, they have been forgotten. Maybe you can still track them down. Maybe they're available on physical media, maybe somewhere, but like no one's talking about them. But there are films that have been sustained by the fandom, and so I want to sort of pivot that a little bit, Millie, because for me, when I talk about classics and cult classics, and it's always the most interesting part of that conversation is who gets to define what's what. And so, like Citizen Kane is a classic because film scholars and film critics say it is. But realistically, if I took Citizen Kane and showed it to a lot of people, just random people, a lot of them would be bored out of their minds. And there's not like some like diehard group of Citizen Kane fanatics that are flocking to indie cinemas for midnight screenings of Citizen Kane. But there is for Rocky Horror Picture Show. There is for blaxploitation films from the 70s. There is, I think, when I look at cult classics, for me, those are films that are only classic because there is this dedicated, passionate, very niche, not necessarily huge fan base behind them. And like that has to be there. And to me, that's what makes cult films interesting. It's not the films themselves per se. It's the fact that there is something about those films, either at the moment that they were released or in the ensuing years, the context of what came after, where some group of people just like rose up and said, this film shall not die, which is so much more interesting. There's so much more energy there than like, this was a film that was a technical masterpiece in the 40s or the 30s or the 50s or whenever. And it's sort of, scholars and critics look back and say, this is amazing. And I love those films. Like I go back and watch, Advise and Consent at least once a year. Like there are great films from that period, but, there's a difference. And, for me, who gets to say what, like, I wish we lived in a world where there was less of the the elite scholars in ivory towers say this is great, and they try to like, keep it alive, but it's not necessarily capturing that audience. I wish we lived in a world where there was more of just all of these little niche fandoms that are so passionate were able to just completely influence the discourse around film. Because for me, that's what makes cult interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like, first of all, to go back to your point about cult movies, I mean, you're right. The audience for cult movies is so, I think that, and I kind of invoke that, like, Danny Peary, I don't know if anybody knows Danny Peary, but he wrote the books, Cult Movies. They're kind of these like formative books for cult movie fans from like the late 70s, early 80s. I think it was the late 70s, but, he was kind of one of the first people to like really talk about and define what a cult movie is. And I think that his definition of it is sort of, I don't know, the one that I like the most, which is that, these are films that are being rediscovered and reinterpreted by new audiences. That maybe these are movies that when they first came out, they were probably critical commercial failures or just didn't have an audience at all. And then over time, an audience has rediscovered it and have started giving it a second look. And I think that for cult movie fans, I think there is an interest in sort of a redemption story or like an underdog story. I find that to be, very compelling when I'm thinking about movies that I haven't seen in forever. And I start going through the thoughts where I'm like, wow, I can't believe people hated this. This movie is actually awesome. And, and that's me, giving it sort of a second look and giving it a reappraisal. And I think that, together, that's kind of how cult movies are formed, where, over time, people just have it clicked for people. Like, actually, you know what? I reject what was said about this movie. I reject the critics that pan this movie, and I appreciate it. And all these other people appreciate it. We're banded together in our, in our sort of like, our collective passion for things that are just maybe being cast off or thrown away.
So go ahead. What I was going to say is, I think what you're tapping into, I think you can't talk about this without talking about marginalized audiences either, because so much of cult is, when you talk about the critics didn't like it, the mainstream didn't like it, the elite sort of film gatekeepers didn't like it. What you're often talking about is like, white heteronormative culture, like Black people, LGBTQ people, like they were seeing themselves being depicted in films, and those films were not going to get a major audience. They were never going to get, they were going to be critical flops in a lot of respects, but they're the films, when you go back and you talk about cult films like Blaxploitation, John Waters, I mean, you like, for me, that's again a part of the appeal, is that we should have less of the white guys talking about film, which is so much of what film culture has been for so long, and more of the marginalized groups.
Part of, I think about this in terms of like when I went to film school, most of my professors, I would say probably like 90% of the professors that I've had in film school were that straight, white, cis men. And, they introduced me to a lot of great stuff, but, yeah, it is, that sort of thing where you're like, well, then who got to decide this for so long? And if you want to even take it back, I mean, it's like, especially with classic Hollywood, I mean, there were virtually no people of color, no women, able to make films in this era. Like if you find somebody, if you find like an Ida Lupino, or, you're like, wow, I can't believe it, she's such a trailblazer. And it was really because they weren't allowed to make movies. And I feel like it's kind of still that way. It's getting better, but it's that thing where like this industry and the culture of film has always been dictated by a certain type of person. And I feel like if it sort of is that thing where like, we hope that as time goes on, you bring these other marginalized groups into this culture, you bring it into the educational system, because that's the other thing too, is that, you need diversity in film professors and film staff and programmers for sure. Cause there's still a lot of that. There's still a lot of like, straight white men who are programming like movie theaters and museums and that kind of stuff. And you want that to change as well. So it's sort of like, yeah, you really have to like change the entire system of how we're understanding and viewing movies to let other people in with their own perspectives. Because there are so many movies over the years that I watched simply because, you know, of course, like somebody that I know who is a straight white man told me to watch it. And I thought, okay, that's a great movie too. But then there's other movies where, you know, movies that are championed specifically by women or people of color or LGBTQ. And those movies are great too. And they should be on the same pedestal.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the academia piece because I too went to grad school for film studies, and you know, I TA'd for a class that was all about women filmmakers, and something that another element to this to cult hits, at least in my view up until this conversation, has been, well, maybe there's a less dominant reading of a film. Maybe it's not literally a John Waters film or a blaxploitation film, and certain people's stories aren't being represented on the surface, but there's again kind of a subverting of the dominant reading, and maybe there's something that the fan community can project onto a given film or a given story, even if it's years later, and going back to that idea of rediscovery or reclaiming. But at the end of the semester in this women filmmakers class, I was just going to say that it was fascinating to see these undergrad students answer the question of, do we need to have a class all about women filmmakers, and to hear the different opinions, because I think the goal would be that one day a Film 101 introduction to film studies class has some kind of mix of representations of different kinds of films beyond just the Citizen Kanes and the Casablancas of the film world. But until that time, you know, we do need to have, I at least thought, you know, I agreed with the students who said, you know, until that time comes, we do need to have classes that show us these other perspectives, that there are, you know, Black lesbian filmmakers making films. There are these avant-garde films coming out, you know, from women filmmakers that we wouldn't have heard of in those mainstream classes. And I will say I did have one teacher who I also TA'd for, who I really respected the fact that for his sort of final assignment, it was like an intro to film class, and the students had a list of films to choose from, and it was a very interesting mix. It wasn't what you'd expect. I mean, one of the options was Anchorman, one of the options was Point Break, Wendy and Lucy. Like, it really ran the gamut in terms of types of filmmakers, types of films. So, you know, I do think there's something to be said for kind of moving in that direction in all spheres. And, you know, I think this brings us to, I'd love to kind of close us out with some questions about your personal favorite cult films, and if there are any Jewish cult classics, because I can certainly name one, and I think you have some thoughts on some others that maybe our listeners haven't heard of.
Yeah. Basically, my favorite cult movies, they change all the time. I sort of swap them in and out, you know, and I kind of do the thing where, you know, I'll kind of go on a tear of a specific type of movie for a while. Like, I'll watch like everything from a director's filmography or everything within a specific genre, and then kind of I'm just like in it for a while. And I'm right now. I'm kind of in this. I'm in this phase of watching, I would say, mid to late 60s to 70s studio films that star, you know, like old classic film actors and actresses. So like Betty Davis's later period movies, Joan Crawford's 60s movies like Straight Jacket and Berserk and everything. You know, Elizabeth Taylor, you know, there's a lot of like, you know, classic actors that were doing more kind of like genre films in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so I'm kind of like in that mode right now. I'm always going to love that kind of studio flop from that era, I would say from the 50s to the 80s. Studio flops are really interesting to me because they a lot of times star really famous people. And there's a moment where I'm like, I wonder if they know what they're doing in the movie. Like, I'm kind of like, oh, they're, whomever, like Olivia de Havilland is in a horror movie. Like, does she know that she's doing it? And I love that concept of sort of like somebody's later period films. My favorite cult movies are kind of that type of stuff, like really just curiosities across the board. I do still love like certain classics for me. Like I love, I do love Night of the Living Dead, but I also think that movie has transcended its cult status. I think it's actually like an actual classic film at this point. And I love, one of my favorites is Ganja and Hess, which is this amazing, Black vampire movie. It was made in the 70s, and it actually stars Dwayne Jones from Night of the Living Dead. And it's kind of this like experimental art film meets horror film, and it's incredible. I always love to mention that one because I really haven't seen anything like it before, and it's definitely a curiosity. But in terms of Jewish cult movies, the first one that comes to mind is this movie that we've actually played on Underground, and it's called An American Hippie in Israel. And it is from, I want to say it's from the late 70s. I think it's early 70s. It's from 1972. And it's kind of this like counterculture. I think the director, his name is Amos Sefer. Or Sefer, I don't know how to really pronounce it properly, but this is a movie that was lost for a very long time. I had certainly heard of it for a long time and never thought I'd ever see it. And then, at some point in the last 10 years, it was released on Blu-ray, of course, and it's very strange. Like it's enjoyable for me, but it's also like, wow, it's totally a part of that kind of Vietnam era counterculture, early 70s vibe. So it's got a lot of that in it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I'm very, very interested to see that. The only film that came to my mind, because I'm certainly less well versed in this world of cult hits, but I always go back to Wet Hot American Summer. Like I've talked about that on this podcast before. I feel like David Wayne is a Jewish cult filmmaker. His films are always really offbeat. I would say with the exception of Role Models, maybe that one was a little bit more mainstream, even in terms of, I think, the style of comedy, but usually his films are just really out there. And Wet Hot American Summer, I think, is the one that's the most Jewish. And I think it's one of those films that has this diehard fan base that has rallied around it later than when it first came out. But yeah, I hope listeners seek out or read up on the film that you mentioned, because it really sounds so fascinating and unlike anything else.
I just want to see it because the Wikipedia entry says it's one of the worst films ever made, and yet it endures.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is like I actually followed that link a few times where I was like, I wonder who made this list of the worst films ever made. I wonder who decides, right?
Yeah, the minions of Wikipedia have decided that this is one of the worst films ever made. I mean, that's, that gets to the heart of the thing, is who gets to decide what's good and what's bad. I mean, everybody has to watch and enjoy it or not on their own. But any film that is that weird, just when you describe it, and then gets described as one of the worst films ever made from that era of Israeli filmmaking, I am in. I'm sold. I don't care what the experience is. It's just like a slice of film history, because that era of Israeli filmmaking is hilarious. I mean, there was a time when Israel only made like weird art house movies. Like that's it. That's all Israel made. And they were, low budget because Israel didn't have a lot of money, so the production values were usually terrible, but they were still interesting films. But that's all they made, and now they're making animated films. They're a darling of the film festival circuit. The Israeli film industry has come a very long way. But
yeah, the other suggestion I would even make is to look up some of the early canon films that were made by the cousins Golan and Globus. Yeah. That part of their history before they came to America of making films is really fascinating to me. Like that sort of lemon popsicle era. I think that was them.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, people when you think about like 80s action schlock, and to think that came from Israel, it's hilarious to me. Anyways.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we're ever going to get that answer. The through line of today of who gets to decide what's good. I think this conversation was certainly informative and educational, and I like the fact that we couldn't really find necessarily concrete answers to some of this, but I hope that our listeners learned some things, learned some perhaps new film terminology, and learned some new ways of thinking about these designations and who puts them forth, and some perhaps off the beaten path films to check out, maybe even on TCM Underground. So Millie, we really can't thank you enough for joining us today. This was a really great discussion, and we're very thankful for your time.
Oh, no, thank you. It was such a pleasure. Loved it.
Before we close out, actually, do you want to plug anything else that we didn't mention, or where people can find you on social media or anything like that?
Obviously, TCM Underground is every Friday night on TCM, usually pretty late. It starts around 2 a.m. on the East Coast, but it does come on earlier on the West Coast if you're listening out there. But then also a lot of the films that we play there end up on our Watch TCM app. So if for whatever reason you don't catch it in the middle of the night, you can always usually catch it on our app. I Saw What You Did is this podcast that I've started with a friend of mine, Danielle Henderson, and it's two women of color talking about film, and it's on the Exactly Right network. But you can find me. I'm on Twitter. I haven't been super active on Twitter lately, but I am there, and I do like to read people's film takes. So I'm around on Twitter. Awesome. Yeah, I hope everyone goes after listening to this to follow you. I think something else that you just mentioned, it's interesting that I think bloggers of the world think that they are the ones that is the answer, right? That they are the ones deciding what's good and what's classic and what's not good and so forth. So the internet is a strange place, but it allows people, I hope, to discover voices like yours and films that they wouldn't have otherwise. So Millie, I must thank you once again. And until next time, we are your hosts, Sarah Glassberg.
Brad Pilcher.
Also producing is Chris Holland, who is our technical director and editor.
Thank you again to special guest Millie De Chirico.
The music you have been humming to all show long is by the incomparable Joe Alterman. Please look him up wherever you get your music.
You can always find more from us as well as show notes at ajff.org/inconversation. Our email address is inconversation@ajff.org. Drop us a line with questions and we might just answer in future episodes.
Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice or check out our YouTube channel for new episodes. Give us a rating, a review. Every little bit helps.
We also should mention that we cannot continue to do this podcast or really any of our other digital programs without your support. If you're willing, if you're able, please make a donation at ajff.org/inconversation. And of course, please tell your friends about the show. Until next time, goodbye.